Order, good afternoon. Welcome to the Women and Equality Select Committee. Today we will be having two panels. The first panel will look at the experience of Muslim communities in the UK, including of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. And panel two will look at community cohesion more broadly by examining real or perceived barriers to cohesion between different ethnic and religious groups and non-religious groups in community cohesion throughout the UK. On teams we have Dr. Naomi from the Assistant General Secretary, not Vice General Secretary, Assistant General Secretary from the Muslim Council of Britain. And we have Professor Javed Khan, MBE, Managing Director of Equi. And in the room with us, we have Akeela Ahmed, MBE, Co-Chair of the British Muslim Network. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your patience in reorganising this again. Very grateful to you all. So I am going to hand over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, and I echo the Chair's sentiments around. Thank you very much for coming a second time to our committee. So my first question is for you, Akeela, please. How would you describe the current situation for Muslims in the UK and how that's evolved over the last few years?
So good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. In terms of the situation for British Muslims, I think it's fair to say that since especially the riots last summer in 2024, many Muslims are feeling anxious, fearful and on edge. I'd like to highlight particularly British Muslim women and young Muslim people, and especially those who are visibly Muslim, so people who basically wear their faith on their head, if you like. I wear a hijab, you can see that I'm Muslim. They are easily identifiable as Muslim, and they are the targets of hate crimes, unfortunately. But since the riots, we have, and even before then, we have seen an increasing issue around Islamophobia. Islamophobia is increasing; it's not decreasing, and the stats recorded by the police only capture the hate crimes that are reported to the police and that meet the threshold for a hate crime. There are a whole range of hate incidents that occur that women and young people are experiencing that, first of all, are not reported to the police, and if they are reported to the police, they're not recorded as a hate crime. So my sense is that beyond the statistics, the issues that people are dealing with are much more worse than what we're actually seeing in the data. I think communities, and especially those at grassroots level, are really dependent on local authorities and local structures to feel safe and to feel that they are able to report the incidents that they're dealing with, including schools and universities. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that these structures are not equipped to deal with the increase in Islamophobia that people are experiencing. And this is compounding the sense of isolation that people are experiencing, and the sense that there is nowhere to go to if they're experiencing any kind of hate crime or Islamophobia. I think there is a sense that government has been slow to tell people what they're going to do post-riots, how they're going to address what happened during the summer last year, and how they're going to address the very strong anti-immigrant sentiment, the very strong anti-Muslim sentiment, and the racism. People are waiting to hear from government on what they're going to be doing, and that hasn't been forthcoming. And I think just to say that within the public discourse, there has been for a long time a sort of latent anti-Muslim narrative that has been bubbling under the surface, and this has come much more to the fore, and we saw that with the riots. And that hasn't gone away. Just because the riots took place doesn't mean that people now think, oh, actually we need to be more nuanced and more measured in the way that we talk about British Muslim communities and other minority communities, including refugees and asylum seekers. And in fact, that has increased, and that has added to the sense of isolation. And women especially are telling me that they are dealing with a whole raft of microaggressions. That's from buses not stopping for them, not being served in the shop, when they're out and about. And that means that then women, and therefore their sort of connected families and connected communities, are adjusting the way they go about their daily lives, basically.
Thank you, Akeela. There'll be opportunity, obviously, for more a bit later, but I just wanted to take up with Dr. Green. What do you have any examples of specific impacts that the summer riots had on Muslim communities?
I think the summer riots were really a culmination of something that has been growing, as has already been said. Islamophobia is the lived reality for Muslims across the UK, and particularly visible Muslims, and particularly Muslim women. It's not unusual to be called names in the streets. I have, people have rolled down their windows and shouted things out the window, and you just have to get on with it, get back to work, or go back to as if nothing has happened. And this is the lived experience of so many people. I think what happened during the summer really intensified that. And I think there's also a sense in the media that it's an old news story. It happened last summer, not realizing that it has ongoing impact. So there are still women in my community who do not feel safe to go to the park with their children, who still not feel safe to leave their homes. There are people who have decided to move from the areas in which they live. Just this week, we saw the horrific attack on the graves in Watford of mainly women and children. And I think, again, that's an extension of the normalisation of Islamophobia in the UK, because it wasn't adequately dealt with. The root causes weren't adequately dealt with in August, and it's continued, and it's grown probably even since August. Online, there's been a normalisation. Even some of your colleagues within Parliament have said things that inflame tensions rather than promote a cohesion between communities and tackle some of this kind of inflammatory language and sensationalist media that has fed into, and particularly in social media. So I think we urgently need action on Islamophobia. We cannot hesitate. This has become quite critical because I'm hearing every day different stories from people, and it feels like, yes, the summer was incredibly intense. But although we don't have the riots, we don't have that immediate urgency, the normal level of Islamophobia has increased since August 2024.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Green. And coming now to Professor Khan, the majority of Muslims in the UK are from a minority ethnic background. But how can you share how racism and Islamophobia are interacting or have interacted?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd agree with what both Akeela and Naomi have said about how your first question about how the situation has evolved. I think there's a couple of things that I didn't hear them mention, which I would like to mention if I can. Firstly, the persistent economic disadvantages are still around, and these have been long-standing. So, for example, discrimination in employment remains a significant issue where people, simply because of a Muslim-sounding name, are not getting shortlisted.
Professor Khan, can I just stop you there? Sorry, Professor Khan. Is there a way for you to move slightly closer to your microphone at all, please?
The volume seems to be low. I can clearly hear you as well. I don't know what the issue is.
That's okay. If you could,
well, I shall try to speak louder. Use my teacher's voice.
Perfect. We've also got bells to contend with at the moment as well, so that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, I shall speak up. So I was talking about persistent discrimination in employment. It still remains an issue and should not be forgotten. And then secondly, I was going to just mention the issue of the public attitudes towards Muslims have worsened, I believe, due to media portrayals and political rhetoric linking Islam to extremism. That has had a significant effect as well, whether it's connected to the summer riots or more generally. And although we have, I think, more people now active in political and civic engagement, I'm talking from the British Muslim community, there still is a significant underrepresentation in those fields and other leadership roles and in the public policy discourse. In fact, my organization, Equi, was created last year, established specifically to try and do something about that, influencing public policy on behalf of British Muslims. So it's still an issue. But coming back to your specific question about Islamophobia and racism, I do believe that there is a key weakness in current thinking, that I think there's a rather rigid distinction between race and religion, which isn't helpful, and it risks overlooking how Muslims are racialized. So Islamophobia is not simply about a theological opposition, it is about perceived Muslimness, which is intrinsically tied to racial and ethnic markers, which are exhibited in a whole range of ways that I think as a committee would be good for you to look into and delve deeper. So Muslims in the UK have a racialized identity. particularly those from South Asia, Middle Eastern, and African descent. They're frequently targeted because of their skin color, because of their clothing, whether it's a hijab or their beard like mine or other traditional attire. But non-Muslims are also targeted because they are perceived to be Muslims. Sikh men, for example, Arab Christians, and others mistaken for Muslims have been attacked. And Islamophobia is often driven by racialized perceptions rather than a religious critique. So hence the need to connect Islamophobia, I believe, with racism in its broadest sense. And there are parallels with other communities as well, of course, for example, the approach to anti-Semitism. Judaism is a religion, but is also regarded as a race. Islamophobia functions, I think, in the same way, targeting a racialized identity rather than just a belief system.
Thank you, Catherine. David had a quick follow-up for Akeela.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Akeela, just a very quick one. You mentioned on hate crime reporting, and I'm very aware that often hate crime's not reported, but you also mentioned it being reported but not as a hate crime. Is that down to the way the individual's reporting, or is that down to the interpretation of how the police are receiving the report?
So I think it's a mixture of both. So I'm aware, 2-3 years ago in Nottingham, there was some hate incidents that Muslim women experienced, and when they reported it to the police, they felt that the police were not taking it seriously. And this is not just in Nottingham, but other places. Often people have been told that, the police have bigger issues to deal with other than hate crime. And sometimes people report something, and the intersection that Javed has just described of somebody's faith and then their sort of ethnic or racialized identity is obviously conflated, and so somebody will present with an intersection of being called the P word, but a Muslim P word, for example, and then the police will not record this properly. When the victim later hears back, they'll hear that the police didn't record it properly. So there are lots of different issues in underreporting, and one of them is around a lack of understanding, I think, when police receive hate crime reports, but also when sometimes local agencies receive reports as well. If a school receives a report, what happens to it? Is it dealt with appropriately? And then also often people just being sort of turned away or not taken seriously.
Thank you. Professor Khan, you talked about there being an increase in Islamophobia, and I think you talked about some of the very real-life incidents as well that we'd heard from Dr. Green as well. What role is social media having on Islamophobia within the UK, including through online abuse?
So I think we've all got to accept that Islamophobia doesn't develop in a vacuum. Media and social media has and continues to have a profound effect, I think. And for example, the spread of Islamophobic misinformation has bred conspiracy theories and fake news about Muslims circulating widely online, and I think it fuels hostility and fear. Many Muslims face harassment, abuse, and threats on social media platforms. Online hate is the description. And I think social media algorithms tend to reinforce these echo chambers, exacerbating polarization between communities, including British Muslims. However, on the positive side, though, and it's worth balancing the argument, on the positive side, in terms of counteracting Islamophobia, social media also provides a platform for Muslim voices, a platform for interfaith dialogue if used correctly, and grassroots activism against Islamophobia can also be kind of shared through social media, and particularly when that kind of debate and dialogue doesn't get enough airtime on mainstream media.
Thank you. Dr. Green, you were nodding through some of what Professor Khan had said there. What role does online content or online communities have in increasing prejudice towards Muslims, do you think?
I think, just to really speak to what Professor Khan said, Muslims are racialized and Islam is racist. So a lot of the discourse online is based on racist stereotypes. It's certainly not a theological debate. It's very much about stereotypes and conspiracy theories. I think one of the scary things, particularly as a mother, is the exposure at a very young age of Muslim children to the kind of narratives about them as a threat as a fifth column, as not really being British, questioning their very identity. Our children are very comfortable in their British Muslim identity. It's not a debate for them, but they see other people questioning that very openly. And it's not just, you don't have to go down some dark corner of the internet. You just need to open up the comment section of any mainstream news outlet, and you will see the comments under there. You'll see the comments under very mainstream stories. Recently, obviously in Birmingham, we saw lots of Muslim communities coming out and doing lots of fantastic work to clear the streets. But underneath, you're seeing these comments. So it's definitely feeding into hysteria. It's feeding into this misinformation and disinformation that is sometimes then brought into the real world. People are more likely to say things to Muslims in real life if they've normalized that hate. There was recently a case here. A friend of mine, she did some work for a local charity, and the individual had gone online, seen a lot of information about Muslims online, phoned the charity that she had been working for and issued a death threat saying they wanted to shoot her in the bleep head, because she was a Muslim who was active. So, excuse my language, but this is the level of hate and normalization that the internet can bring. It's a very specific example, but it's not an isolated one. So I think there needs to be a greater effort to counteract these narratives, because at the moment it seems that there's very little done in order to prevent this from spreading.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Akeela, we heard from a previous panel that from CST and Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, that they used to have fairly good engagement with being able to take anti-Semitic material down from places like Facebook and YouTube and others, but they found it increasingly difficult on X. For example, I think at one stage one of the witnesses says they just don't even bother anymore. And Dr. Green has just said that there needs to be much more done to counter this. Have you experienced any change in the last few years, for example, on the online space, particularly in social media for Muslim users online?
Yeah, definitely. I think that, the riots war started by misinformation being spread on X and other platforms. Telegram was used very heavily for I don't want to call them protesters, but for the people who took part in the riots to organise themselves and to start going out in different parts of the country. Whereas previously, Twitter/X, there were people there that you could raise issues with when there were issues in the past around anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. Now there isn't anybody that will respond when raising these kinds of issues. And similarly, Meta has had a change in policy over the last few months, and they are also now very difficult to speak to and get in touch with. And in the past, research and academics have shown that Facebook has been a platform where people have organised, in the US, I'm talking about the US right now, where they've organised protests to be held outside mosques, and Facebook groups were being used to do that. And Facebook is another platform where people will do this kind of organising, where there will be these echo chambers where they will spread misinformation and anti-Muslim hatred, and there's no checks, there's no accountability, and there's no sense of how people as individuals can report it or even engage at a higher level from a policy point of view. Social media companies don't seem to be taking their responsibilities seriously. I think in the run-up to the Online Harms Act being brought in, there was more openness, but things have changed since then.
Thank you. Yes, I can echo that sentiment. I would say that my Facebook is going down the same cesspit as X, unfortunately. Kirith.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Khan, you mentioned a rigid distinction between race and religion. I want to know what your thoughts are on whether you think the definition of Islamophobia or anti-Muslim hatred would be helpful. Oh, we can't hear you.
A widely accepted definition is essential, and I'd suggest.
Professor Khan, your sound is dropping in and out.
Oh.
That's it.
Hello, is that any better?
That's much better, thank you.
Looking forward. I was going to say, I would offer 4 reasons for why a definition is essential, I think, in the UK. First, I would say protection. I think a definition would help law enforcement track and combat Islamophobic hate much more effectively than currently happens. Secondly, I think for policy developers, government agencies would then have a clear framework to address systemic discrimination against Muslims. Then I would say for public understanding, it is vital as well, because the definition would help distinguish between what is legitimate critique of Islam, which I don't think Muslims have any issue with, and what is discrimination against Muslim people, which we should all have an issue with. And then finally, I'd say there is also international precedent that we should build this on. So other countries and organizations like the United Nations, like the EU, like Canada, have already accepted formal definitions of Islamophobia.
Thank you. And do you think that there's a risk that any definition of Islamophobia might impact freedom of speech?
Well, if crafted well, I don't think so. Because, I can give you my own personal opinion as a British Muslim. I have no issues with freedom of speech. We have to operate within the British law. And I think a carefully crafted definition that offers protection and offers clear definition that we can all hold on to, and it can influence the way that the police, that the NHS, that schools and other public bodies operate, then that should not impinge on freedom of speech. It's more about protection for those who are currently suffering.
Thank you very much. Dr. Green, Akeela, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I do.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So I was going to say that I think I agree with what Javed has said, and I think also a definition would help bring around clarity, and it would be a working. Any definition of anti-Muslim hatred, Islamophobia, would be a working definition. It'd have a non-statutory basis, so it wouldn't be a legal definition, but it would bring around clarity of what is. When people are straying into bigotry, hatefulness, prejudice and discrimination, and when they are not, and it will bring around clarity for freedom of speech, I think. I think that would help. I think also it would bring around some consistency as well. At the moment, there are different organisations, different institutions which have their own definition, which works for them, but there's differences across the board. So somebody who is going to a particular university in one part of the country might be able to have some recourse if they experience Islamophobia at university, whereas another student at another university will not have that recourse because their university might not have a definition of Islamophobia. They might not have the same level of understanding.
Yeah.
So I think a definition would be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Thank you, Kirith. David.
Thank you very much. I'll come to you if I can, Akeela. How would you assess the work of government and local authorities in combating anti-Muslim hatred and promoting community cohesion? And what more do you think they need to do?
So if I deal with community cohesion first, so I briefly touched on this earlier in my earlier answer, that basically I think there is almost like a postcode lottery when it comes to community cohesion. There's differences around the country. Since the riots, I think MHCLG had put in a certain amount of funding towards community cohesion, and this was delivered via local authorities. Now, if I speak to people in Middlesbrough who are working at a grassroots level, especially Muslim women, they will say they are still wondering what's happening to that funding. They do not know what's happening to that funding. Another example is in Walsall. There are grassroots community organisations that are getting funding from, not from government, from other places, and they are trying to engage local structures, the police commissioner, the local authorities, around building their understanding of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred and what they can do to tackle it at a local level. And they're finding that there is a lack of engagement by local authorities. So I think there is an issue around community cohesion where at the moment the structures are all delivered through local authorities, and then there are issues at that local authority level. It's a different story, for example, in Nottingham and maybe other places as well. So I think that there needs to be more done in terms of, there's a lot of pressure on local authorities at the moment, and so I think that from central government there's a role that it can play in terms of ensuring that local authorities prioritise it. I think similarly on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, again, it's a postcode lottery. I don't, from speaking to practitioners around the country, there are huge differences in local authorities' understanding of what Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred is. They might have a particular understanding from a kind of political side, depending on the makeup of the population and the politicians in that area, but not from a kind of actual sort of delivery side and how to actually help people not only sort of feel protected and know where to report Islamophobia or racism, but also how to actually address some of the root causes and bringing communities together, reducing the kind of misperceptions and the stereotypes that exist. I think there is a much bigger role to play for schools and universities. I've heard from a lot of university students who've experienced Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred, especially since the increases post the October the 7th atrocities, and there's just nowhere for them to go to report what they're experiencing. And if they do report it, it's not understood, it's not heard, it's not dealt with. Similarly, in schools, there is a lack of policy, I think, and understanding around anti-Muslim bullying and the racism that young people are dealing with. And especially if they are dealing with it on the way to school or on the way home from school. Just before October the 7th, I held a focus group with young people across London. Many of them said that they were dealing with racism and Islamophobia. They were being called terrorists, they were dealing with bullying, and it was actually coming from adults. And this was when they were travelling to school and from schools on public transport. And when they would tell their teachers at school, the teacher would say, well, this happened outside the school, so we're really sorry that you've experienced this, but we don't know how to help you. So there are lots of areas and ways that I think government could do more to address Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Professor Khan, if I could come to you, what do you think are the most effective ways to combat Islamophobia?
So, having worked in central government and local government for a number of years, one of the things I learned over that time is to get those organizations to respond best, you need very practical, measurable interventions, and that focuses the mind. So I would suggest a number of very practical things that they should be doing. I'm talking, this could be government or local councils, I think easily adaptable. Firstly, hate crime reporting and response. So are hate crimes against Muslims being properly documented, and what's the follow-up as a result of that? Then I'd say that the level of representation and inclusion of Muslims in decision-making processes, not just laissez-faire, consultations and the odd kind of circulars that are sent out, but serious inclusion in the development of that local policy making and decisions. In terms of community engagement, I'd say are councils promoting and funding interfaith and intercultural initiatives? Because there's lots of research out there that shows that kind of local activism actually helps support community cohesion. It tackles Islamophobia as well. Are public policies helping to reduce discrimination, or are they actually reinforcing Islamophobic biases? That needs to be monitored actively and reported upon, I'd say, on an annual basis. Are the councils investing in anti-discrimination programs? For example, in education, school-based awareness programs and college level. There's a great example I've come across called the Linking Network, which began in Bradford. You may have heard of it. They work really hard, and they've expanded further than that now. And so they link schools, they link children and young people from different races and cultures. They support teachers with toolkits across, as I say, faith and cultures, trying to combat discrimination, prejudice, and Islamophobia. Very successful. There are lots of other examples like that as well that could be rolled out across a whole range of schools, but also other institutions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And Dr. Green, coming to you now. So looking at the Muslim Council of Britain, what work do you do or plan to do with other groups from other communities to improve cohesion?
So the MCB is an umbrella body. The council is democratically elected from our affiliates, and so we represent a cross-section of Muslim society across the UK, and our affiliates are doing lots of fantastic work at the grassroots level between communities. Certainly as MCB, we have contact with other faith communities, interfaith networks, and other sort of community organisations that we have regular conversations with and meetings with at sort of the policy level, but certainly we also encourage our grassroots members as well. And there's lots of different things going on. There's soup kitchens, there's blood drives, street cleanups, there's lots of collaborations. Even if it's just a coffee morning, we have the Visit My Mosque. This is the 10th year of Visit My Mosque, which we encourage mosques across the country to open their doors, invite people in, and also on some occasions go out to other communities, meet other faith communities and other community groups to increase the awareness of each other, because one of the key issues with Islamophobia is the misinformation and disinformation, and the best way you can target that is by getting to know each other and breaking down some of those stereotypes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Catherine.
Thank you. Yeah, this question is open really to whoever's got some experience, perhaps, of what's been going on in Wales. But I'm an MP from Wales, and there were no riots in Wales in the summer. Which I'm really obviously grateful for and pleased about. But was there a different approach, do you think, taken by Welsh Government or by communities there, or community cohesion is stronger? Or is there, do you think, another reason for that? Or if you don't know, that's absolutely fine.
Can I come in there?
Sure.
I went on a fact-finding mission to Wales, I think a year and a half ago, and so I learned all about the anti-racism curriculum, and it was a group of people from different faith backgrounds, and I must say I was very, very impressed with the Welsh Government's approach, actively anti-racist, actively learning about different cultures and different faith groups. We visited several schools, and I think that proactive approach is something the devolved nations, England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, can really learn from the approach in Wales. I do think that was a key factor in the difference that we saw in the summer.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything to add to Catherine's question? No, thank you. I just had a quick one on this section around combating Islamophobia, and it leads from the last section, really. Do you think it's possible to combat Islamophobia without defining it? Akeela?
So I think the debate around whether or not we should define Islamophobia has been around for a number of years, and actually I think in a nutshell it's not possible. This debate has been going on. There have been different definitions obviously that have been put forward. The APVG for British Muslims put forward a definition in 2018, and we have seen how actually. So first of all, let me say that a definition is a first step in dealing with Islamophobia, and it's a needed step. And we've seen how, whilst this sort of debate has been rumbling on, Islamophobia has been increasing. So it's one tool in a toolbox needed to deal with Islamophobia and racism and anti-Muslim hatred as experienced by British Muslims. And it is an essential tool, but it is a first step. It's not a means to an end, but it will help significantly in the way that we've seen how a definition of anti-Semitism has helped deal with anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Professor Khan, did you have anything to add on that?
So in terms of promoting community cohesion and combating Islamophobia, I mean, Equi is going to soon be launching a report on this topic, but I can give you a heads up on some of the messages that might be relevant to this discussion today. I mean, again, very practical suggestions. I think we need public awareness campaigns. We need nationwide initiatives to challenge the misconceptions about Muslims, because some polling that we've done shows that works. That we surveyed 2,000 people through YouGov, and 80% of people said that they would have a positive impression of British Muslims if they had more facts at their disposal, if there were ways that they could access more information, and they're not getting it at the moment. And what they tend to see is the negativity. I think interfaith and intercultural dialogue makes a difference. So I think government should develop a cross-departmental strategy to engage faith and belief groups as delivery partners. I think that will help. They should fund a national training and capacity building scheme for faith and belief groups, focusing on partnership working, safeguarding, community development, and so on. I think they should develop a toolkit that gives clear guidance for local authorities, for police forces, for the NHS to effectively engage with faith partners. I think we also need policy reforms to strengthen legal frameworks to protect against discrimination. It is, I think, as one of my colleagues said earlier, it is too woolly. We need to improve Muslim representation, ensuring that their roles in whether it's politics or media or leadership positions are available and their voices are heard. We need to strengthen hate crime laws, making it easier to prosecute hate crimes and ensure justice for the victims. Again, it is too hit and miss at the moment. And we need to support community-led initiatives which support grassroots organizations tackling Islamophobia, because there are lots of organizations out there that are doing a lot, could do a lot more if only they were supported.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I'd like to draw the committee to my register of interests as well. I'm going to move on now, Dr. Green. These are just some questions about Muslim Council of Britain, because successive governments have had various policies when it comes to engagement or non-engagement with MCB, and I just wanted to understand a bit more behind that. There was a time many, many years ago where MCB was on a list, an official list, and it was taken off that official list by a Labour government because there was changes in personnel. But what has this had as an impact? You've said that you've got an affiliation from different mosques from around the country. How big is your organisation? How widespread is it? And what difference does this make, this kind of inconsistency around engagement with government?
Sorry, just on host. MCB is a very diverse organisation, so we have different, Muslims in the UK are incredibly diverse. There's 4 million of us, and we come from different ethnic backgrounds, different schools of thought. MCB is a cross-section of that, and we have around 500 affiliates, and we have partnerships with others who may not be actually affiliates, but we work in collaboration with other Muslim communities. I think it really came to during COVID. There was a lot of cooperation between BIMA, British Islamic Medical Association, and ourselves. There's a lot of work at the grassroots level with Muslim communities, ensuring that they had the best information available and they were able to follow government guidance. And there was a gap in that then communication between ourselves and government. We have specific expertise, we have knowledge within the communities that we serve. We have Vision 2050. We want to make sure that we are improving the Muslim community, that we're inspiring and serving the community, and not just the Muslim community, but the wider UK community. It's a conversation. We've never really got a clear answer why we were, why we're still sort of out in the cold. I think it's a shame that a segment of the Muslim population are singled out and are not engaged with. And I think a lot of the conversation about MCB is without us. So there's all this conversation about us without us. And a lot of our critics have no idea about the who is in the MCB, who is our leadership team, the structure of MCB, how we operate. But the door is open. People are very welcome to come and have that conversation at any time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. Samantha.
Thank you. Hi, hello. Independent reports have underlined the threat of anti-blasphemy activism to community cohesion. And how can the government, local authorities and relevant organisations work together to reduce anti-blasphemy activism within the UK? And I'll come to you for me, Akeela.
Thank you. So first of all, I just want to say that what you've described as anti-blasphemy activism is by no means my expertise, but it's also by no means my experience of British Muslim communities. There are, as Naomi said, there are 4 million Muslims in this country living all around the country, and they're from very diverse, they're not homogenous. And I think this, so I wanted to kind of put that out there. I think what you might be alluding to is basically the incident that took place in Batley and then recommendations following those incidents in Batley. And really, as someone who's been working in this space with British Muslims, but also with other organisations around cohesion and integration and interfaith, and actually what we're seeing, what happened at Batley is basically symptomatic of a wider issue of people receiving the information online, becoming more polarised, and also a significant lack of investment in community cohesion by successive governments over the last 10, 15 years. And so what we're seeing is that people are not, they're not interacting, they're not understanding each other, they're not knowing each other, and then this leaves them vulnerable to being sort of, I guess, sold a kind of black and white, understanding or version of whether that's Islam or Muslims or cohesion or other minorities, basically. And then they're reaching into that. So, if we think about specifically Batley, some of the actors that, they took that issue and then they basically exploited it for their own sort of agenda and ideology. They were also acting in places like Birmingham and other areas as well. And a lot of misinformation was also coming from was being shared on WhatsApp and online from outside of the UK. So I think actually rather than developing initiatives just thinking about anti-blasphemy, I think that there needs to be a much more broader approach to cohesion, looking at the vulnerabilities across the piece, whether that is around people's understanding of faith or Muslims or Islam, or people's understanding of sex education and relationships, for example. I think, otherwise you're just dealing with the symptoms, and then you're putting more resources into dealing with the symptoms and not actually dealing with the root causes of what's happening across society.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions today. If there's anything that you feel that we could have explored more in greater depth, or that you think actually as soon as you log off or that you walk out of here, Akeela, you think, I wish I'd said this, please follow it up in writing with us. And thank you so much for your time and your expertise today. Really appreciate it. We'll move on to panel 2 now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For the Women and Equalities Select Committee, we've got Dr. Dhaliwal, Trustee from the Southall Black Sisters. We have Andrew Copson, Chief Executive of Humanists UK, and Professor Cantle, Advisor at Belong Network and Public Policy and Cohesion Specialist. Welcome to you all. Professor Cantle, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'll pass you on to David.
Thank you. Thank you for coming in. And I'm going to start with you, Andrew, if I may. So just from your perspective, what does community cohesion mean?
Starting with the big one.
Why not?
Well, I think you've had lots of definitions in evidence that's been given to you, but I think what I would say from a humanist point of view is the important thing about community cohesion is that it's not a static thing. It's not just everyone sort of being in a good state of relations with each other. It's a dynamic, ongoing process of good relations, of encounter with others, and I think it means a society that fosters a sense of belonging and freedom and fairness for everybody and builds trust, every day between individuals from different backgrounds. And I think that because it's a dynamic process rather than just a state, it requires meaningful interactions and relationships, every day and everywhere and all the time.
Thank you. And Dr. Dhaliwal, perhaps you can add your thoughts on that as well, but also if you can tell us what you think the key barriers to community cohesion are and how we can perhaps overcome them.
I've got so much to say on both of those things. So with community cohesion, we've had... I think obviously, as a starting point, cohesion is something that's desirable. It's preferable to hatred, segregation, division, discrimination. But we've had difficulty with that as a framework, and we basically want to put to the committee today that that's not an appropriate framework to address the issues that arose last summer, and that what we ought to be doing is really focusing on equalities, non-discrimination and a human rights framework, and emphasising that human rights are indivisible and they're universal. So I just want to put that out there, and there's a couple of reasons why we have difficulties with the community cohesion framework. Firstly, and I think there's been quite a lot of writing on this, I'd start with Ted Cantle's work on this, but there's been a lot of anti-racist writing on the ways in which actually what it's done is it's sidestepped and pushed us away from what are the key issues. And people are saying that now as well, in terms of why is this an appropriate response to the riots that took place last summer, when those were so clearly about rising anti-immigrant rhetoric, divisive, fueling racism, hatred, and racist violence stoked by the far right. So why are we trying to squeeze this into a kind of a cohesion issue when what we should be doing is focusing on anti-racist strategies and thinking very clearly about a much clearer national anti-racist strategy and local anti-racist strategies, and we should be doing our work on the Equalities Act at local areas anyhow. We should be doing the work around the public sector equality duty. So one of the issues has been about anti-racist critique, which you may or may not be familiar with. There's quite a lot of it, talking about how community cohesion is a kind of moralistic language. It kind of pushes and expands those distinctions between deserving and undeserving migrants, between good and bad citizens. It's values loaded. It's not about rights. Yeah, and it's largely focused on and putting the onus on minority communities to make themselves more palatable, more likeable. And it's definitely been part of a pushback against diversity in a broad sense. So as an organisation, we ended up in this curious position where we actually were defending multiculturalism, whereas we had a kind of a historical critique of multiculturalism. But because multiculturalism was kind of being treated with such disdain, and community cohesion was being pushed forward as part of an integration agenda, which looked so much like old school assimilationism, basically. And a lot of the kind of structural issues that minority communities have had to deal with, and institutionalized racism. So we had this huge recognition of institutionalized racism through the Macpherson inquiry. That seemed to be pushed aside. All of the stuff that led to Asians defending their communities in the north of the country, the racist violence, the stuff being pushed through letterboxes, things being set on fire, that was all the kind of far-right mobilisations, that was all pushed to the side, and it was all started to be about sort of integrating and finding out why Asians are living separate lives, and the kind of backstory to how they got there and how they're living in some of the kind of worst housing, and government's role in that was kind of completely set aside. So that's the first point. The second point, sorry, is there a timer on this?
Keep the second point brief, please.
Okay, so briefly, sorry, there's a point 2 and a point 3. The point 2 is that we were directly affected by the community cohesion agenda. So one of the men that was on the Cohesion and Integration Commission, Dara Singh, was actually the leader of the councillor, the leader of Ealing Council at the time, and they made a concerted decision to withdraw SBS's funding and push for a generic service provision for all women affected by domestic violence. And we took them to court. We pushed for a judicial review and we won that case. So it's worth looking at Lord Moses' judgment on why it's important to have specific and specialist services for women, minoritized women specifically, to address disproportionate impact of domestic violence, but also to assist them to participate more in public life. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that actually the reality is that what we've seen, and this is relevant to the first panel discussion as well, is that actually we've seen multi-faithism in practice. It's not been a move to generic service provision. It was channeled through Tony Blair's commitment to a faith agenda. There's been a huge expansion of space for faith-based organisations and actually an attack on secular progressive organisations in the process.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come to Professor Cantle now. and feel free to come back on any of those points. But I was quite interested to, obviously in 2001, your report, the Cantle report, found that some communities in the UK led parallel lives. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that means.
Yes, I can. But firstly, if I could just respond to the last speaker. So it's not my experience at all over the last 20 years that community cohesion has in any way ignored discrimination and equality. Just the opposite. But cohesion tries to deal with it in a different way. Instead of simply controlling behaviour, the cohesion agenda attempts to change people's attitudes. And that's the fundamental difference. And that's why it was a completely new agenda from 2001. And as you'll be aware, my report made 66 recommendations, most of which were implemented. It took around 5 years or so to get them fully implemented. And the result of that was that we saw a reduction in discrimination. We saw communities working together. Sometimes for the first time, we saw a breakdown in some of the parallel live experiences that we had. We saw better relations in schools. We saw better relations at the interfaith level because the cohesion agenda really focused on how people lived and worked together. At no point did we ever ignore the discrimination agenda or the equality agenda. It was entirely embraced by cohesion. So I think that's a bit of a misrepresentation of the agenda. And what we need now after the 2024 riots is exactly the same. Of course, we need to think about equality and discrimination, but at the same time, we need to change people's attitudes towards difference, and to ensure that people are better able to understand each other, relate to each other, and work together. So it is a new agenda, but I think it has shown already to pay dividends.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, David. Samantha.
Thank you very much. I beg your pardon, I just lost my place. So we were talking about how we address community cohesion, but I do wonder what you think of the lack of funding to local council budgets and whether it's affected community cohesion, including through provision of services and cohesion programmes themselves. And perhaps I can come back to you, Professor Cantle, on that one.
Yes, that's absolutely a fundamental question. It's why we're here today. It's why the response to the 2024 riots was so poor. Because we had lost the capacity, not just at local government level, but at local community organisation level, at faith organisation level. What has happened over the last 20 years is that we've had report after report following disturbances, which have flagged up the need for more work to be done, often at a very low cost. And then once the disturbances have passed and the focus has shifted away, then I'm afraid the support and the activity also falls away. So we are constantly trying to catch up with some level of capacity at local level. The classic example of this is the 2022 riots in Leicester. Leicester was a beacon for community cohesion. It had tension monitoring programs in place. It had very good relationships between communities, but all of that had lapsed. And the resilience of the local communities was, I'm afraid, very poor by the time of the 2022 riots. And consequently, nothing was in place to try and deal with the disturbances. Similarly, in last year's riots, we saw at the community level, most of the cohesion programs have long since lapsed. None of the tension monitoring programs that were implemented at very, very low cost were in place. And there was just an inability to respond and to intervene before the riots took place. Everybody could see what was building up. We could see the pressure that communities were under, but there was no interventions before they took place. and the interventions that came afterwards suddenly had to be cobbled together. We need a consistent cohesion approach which involves very little money, but it does require constant monitoring, constant vigilance. And as Andrew Copson said, societies are dynamic. Cohesion is constantly changing. The threats that we have today are very different to the threats we had 20 years ago. And so consequently, the cohesion programme has to be updated regularly and monitored and intervened with on a regular basis.
Thank you for that. It's interesting to hear that it wouldn't take much money. In light of the fact there isn't much going around, that's good to hear.
Yes.
But talking about declining levels of things, I'm going to come to you, Andrew, and I wonder what effect do you think that declining levels of religion have on community cohesion, if any?
Yeah, definitely I can answer that. First of all, I just want to agree with what Ted said earlier as well about equality and human rights not being separate from or antithetical to community cohesion. I mean, if I'd expanded on my definition further, I would absolutely have said that the human rights and equality framework has to be the basis of the cohesion agenda, and foundational to it. The effect of declining levels of religiosity, it's difficult because I'm very aware that some people claim that declining levels of religiosity lead to declines in cohesion, because the argument is that when people came together in religious communities, they formed more cohesive groups within society, and society as a whole was more cohesive. There's no evidence for that, so I certainly don't think that a decline in religiosity has led to any decrease in cohesion. For a very long time, the UK and England in particular has been a very secular society. Now, obviously, most people have no religious beliefs, most people have no religious identity, most people don't practice a religion, and I think that's a pretty constant line that's unrelated to cohesion. But I do think that, as Ted pointed out, in some parts of the country, religious differences and the growth of religiosity is leading to a decrease in cohesion. I think that the transnational connections that lead to some religious conflicts globally being played out within the UK. Leicester would be a good example of a sort of Hindu nationalism and Islamic identity sort of possibly being in conflict with each other in the UK. So I think that some religious elements might feed a lack of cohesion. Ultimately, I think that the answer to this is to resource and develop those parts of society where people from different religious and non-religious backgrounds come together. So I think that the focus should be on shared activities, shared interests. That's where you build community resilience. The biggest type of group, for example, this is a great statistic, the type of group that delivered most help during the pandemic in terms of food parcels and support was sports groups. There are areas, especially martial arts groups with younger people. Belong has done some great work on this, where people from all sorts of different religious and belief backgrounds come together in an institution. And I think that the increase in funding of other civic institutions where people come together, whether it's schools, and we haven't got onto religious schools, but obviously I think that religious schools should be phased out, and we should have secular schools where people can all generally come together. Schools, libraries, other civic institutions that can be sponsored and supported in space made for them when they've been hollowed out and defunded often recently by local authorities are the areas where cohesion can happen, and religion is irrelevant to all of that.
It's interesting because that nicely leads on to my next question, which I'll come to you if I may, Dr. Dhaliwal. Going back to religion and it playing a part, what are the different ways that religious affiliation and ethnicity in the UK can intersect, and what impact can these ways have on community cohesion? I know you don't like the phrase, but where it does come together, ethnicity and religion, how can that benefit?
I think a point in case is talking about Islamophobia. Yeah. It makes much more sense to talk about anti-Muslim racism because it's actually a form of racism. And sort of pushing it over to Islamophobia is to draw quite a high wall around it and make it very much about religious sensibilities, much more than addressing the power axis, because we are talking about power relations here, and address the axis of power, which is race and racism. So how does it overlap? I was actually going to say something, I'm sorry to be so contrary, I was going to say something quite different, which is that we have seen a significant fracturing of racial solidarities within local areas because of the actions of fundamentalist organisations. And so the stuff that's happened in Leicester, that's very much about Hindu fundamentalist groups building up a base and using WhatsApp groups and stuff in order to perpetrate anti-Muslim hatred, basically. That's what was going on there, and to circulate a lot of misinformation. So what we've experienced on our doorstep in Southall is that the whole place has been reconstituted in terms of religious identities, and there's been a massive fracturing of the concept of Asian, and that's been very much pushed by fundamentalist groups. So Sikh fundamentalist groups have been very central to that. After 9/11, they were very fast to say, we are not Muslims, and we want to be identified as Sikh. They've wanted to be identified as Sikh in the census. They've wanted to be seen as a specific ethnic group. They've actively fractured those racial solidarities. So, a lot of the reason why we organise as a black and minoritized women's organisation is that there are so many similarities and continuities between what Asian women are experiencing. But Sikh fundamentalists would say, no, that's completely separate and different to us. And what we see is that actually they're all experiencing honour-based abuse, forced marriage, transnational abandonment. It's pretty equal across the board, and that's because of the cultural norms, but there's definitely an intermingling of cultural and religious pressures, right? So religion simply doesn't exist outside of a cultural, economic and social context. So it's always changing, but these organisations want to fix religious identities, and they've actively encouraged religious identities. And we see it in our local area, pretty much, and the state has played a part in that. And we do need to look at the state's practice around encouraging faith schools, encouraging a faith sector, bringing faith groups to the table in order to discuss issues like domestic violence, where actually they've been much more involved in mediating women back into abusive relationships than actually supporting them to find alternatives. And this is why, for us, secularism is very, very important as an approach to service provision.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. Kirit.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for you, Andrew. What sort of engagement, if any, do you think takes place between faith groups and non-faith groups, and how is this typically organised?
I think there are two types, really. So sometimes long-established interfaith initiatives will attempt to include non-religious voices, either by approaching perhaps local humanists or other non-religious groups, although of course they don't exist at the same scale as religious groups in the country, or by bringing non-religious voices in from other parts of the community, like, for example, a teacher who presents a non-religious view, or a counsellor or something like that. And I think that's good as far as it goes, but that sort of face-to-face dialogue only takes place usually at a very elite level. Of course, we know it's very dominated also by men and self-styled community leaders. So I've always thought that the preferable way to engage was not a phrase the old pre-2010 government used to use, not just face-to-face, but side-by-side, and to actually sponsor joint activities where people can do things together, take on a local issue together, start a campaign together, or even do a garden together, whatever it might be, if your appetite's not activist, but more sort of hobby driven. And I think that sort of encounter between religious and non-religious, where you don't make a fetish of the difference or of religiosity at all, is much more productive. And that sort of thing, whether it's community cafes or other projects, as I say, I think is the best way to bring religious and non-religious people together. And if you draw on the local community, then the non-religious are over 50%, so you're inevitably going to trawl some people into your net. You don't need to make a big deal of the difference, I think.
Okay, and so I think in the last panel, Dr. Green mentioned the Visit My Mosque initiative that has been running in some areas of the country. Do you think something like that is productive as well?
Yeah, I do. I've got a lot of time for Naomi's work. We've done lots of work with her with the Northern Ireland Humanists, and I think it's a great initiative. And I think that schools as well should be teaching more in the round about religious and non-religious worldviews, community outreach, going to each other's buildings. You know, I very much remember growing up in the 1980s in the industrial Midlands, visiting a mosque from my primary school, and it just being a complete eye-opener, and I was able to take on my nan, my dad's mum, when she said some unsavoury things, unfortunately, you know, in a very precocious sort of 8-year-old way. But I think that sort of engagement is absolutely essential. And you know, you could sort of be cynically just regard it as very superficial, but I don't think it is. I think it does, you know, opening doors and welcoming people in and bridging is important. I just think it can't be the only thing that's done. Otherwise, you know, you feel like you're being guests in different people's homes. But really, what we need is a solidarity of being together as equals. And I think that projects and other work is more likely to engender that sort of feeling.
Opportunities for that.
Opportunities for that, which have really been hollowed out. I mean, we still have a very thriving civil society in this country. There was a point 20 years ago when it was the most thriving in Europe. I don't know if that's still the case, but you know, there's a lot of community groups, a lot of community infrastructure still left in England, even though it has been undermined by lack of funding and other you know, social factors that aren't to do with government. But I still think that those sorts of initiatives and that sort of community feeling is the best way of addressing these questions.
That's great, thank you. And Professor Cantle, who do you think fulfills the role of community leaders in the UK?
Well, obviously, it varies depending upon which part of the country, even which area of a particular city. I think the problem is that community leaders can sometimes be part of the problem. They're often the gatekeepers of their community rather than the gateways to their community. And whenever I've been involved in that sort of work in particular areas, I've tried to make sure that we don't just talk to community leaders. We talk particularly to women's organisations, to youth organisations. We try and make sure that we get as many diverse voices as we can. Some communities are well served by community leaders. Others, I'm afraid, find that a way of keeping control of their communities. So I think you have to tackle it on a case-by-case basis. But I am always suspicious, really, I guess, of going into any community and just finding that the engagement is through the community leader, often self-appointed community leader. And I think that's something that at the local level we have to take very seriously and make sure that we really are reaching all sections of the community and engaging with all of the different voices.
Thank you. And Dr. Dhaliwal, do you think women are equally represented as community leaders? And what, if any, are the challenges related to women gaining and holding leadership roles in their communities?
I mean, there's just a
big
default.
Question.
There's a default position. Our experience is that there's a default position of going to the largest religious institution in the local area, because there's a kind of underlying majoritarianism that kind of feeds this. Yeah. So, you know, and that has a reproductive effect, right? So you see a religious institution that's bought a big building, it has lots of people going through it. You assume that it's representative of the community in that area, but actually it's very much defined by a very bounded notion of that particular religion. But everything around community consultation starts to, I'm talking about my experience in Southall starts to revolve around that particular organisation. And, you know, when we have Vaisakhi processions through Southall, for instance, all the politicians, local politicians are there. Every consultation involves the main Sikh gurdwaras in Southall, and those are very exclusive gurdwaras actually, because they rely on one specific interpretation of Sikhism and they push out all the other interpretations of that religion. So the Ravidasis, who are also low caste, so you see this caste structuring going on. Or people that believe in living gurus, living saints, they're not represented, and they're seen as apostates, they're seen as blasphemers. So they are diminished, and this group that has a kind of large building get all the resources. They then get a faith school that reproduces the identity. You know, it's very much a reproductive effect. So obviously we are very concerned about that in terms of what that means, and Shaista Gohir, for instance, some time back, made some really astute observations about what was happening in Birmingham, where she was talking about how local relations of power work within Asian communities, which is very pertinent to the conversation on sexual exploitation, right? Because you have a link up between a specific elite of businesses with often Labour Party officials, but local politicians and religious institutions, and raced managerialism within the council. And that ensures that particular issues are kept off of the table. So she made a really astute observation that we've been raising for a while about how local relations of power work. And we need to talk about power. We need to address that and grapple with that at a local level.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kirith. Alex.
Thank you. Mr. Copson, I'd like to ask you first, what role do you think religious education, or PHSE, in the UK currently plays in community cohesion, so specifically the curriculum rather than faith schools? And what changes, if any, would you make to the curriculum to promote community cohesion?
Well, I think it does already do a better job than we generally realise, especially in comparison with other countries that don't have such a broad subjectivity. It is very unusual to have, as we have in schools in England, as we've developed with difficulty over long history, but anyway we have it now, a subject that teaches about different, that takes as its baseline the assumption that it will teach about different religions and beliefs, not just for the point of knowing about these aspects of human heritage, but also for other instrumental points, that you might know more about your fellow citizens, that you might be a better citizen of the world yourself and be able to navigate those differences. So I think already we're in a better position than lots of other jurisdictions to have that curriculum in service of a cohesion aim. I think it needs to be made more diverse. At the moment, it can present many religions and other worldviews as monolithic. Of course, that plays to those most powerful within those religions who get to choose, therefore, what their religion looks like. I think because the curriculum is determined locally and not nationally, that is exacerbated by the local effect of gatekeepers and power hoarders that we've been hearing about in other contexts. I completely agree with everything that was just said about that. So I think there needs to be national curriculum. I think it needs to evolve into a subject about different religions and worldviews, and also contain more, including humanism, contain more critical engagement with these ideas, more of an emphasis, not just on mutual understanding, but on thinking for yourself, because freedom and equality is also important in this. And I also think that it should begin to be inspected again, as it was until recently, as the whole school curriculum was until recently, on how well it does promote cohesion. I think the whole school curriculum should be inspected on that. I think it was one of the recommendations of Ted's report, which was implemented and then abandoned a few years ago. So I think the RE curriculum it has a lot of powerful potential. It's already achieving some of that potential, I think. But it could do a lot more if it was reformed along those lines.
Thank you.
And PSHE I didn't mention, but of course PSHE after 2010, when the curriculum that was put together in primary and secondary level by the then government, after the election in 2010, it was effectively deleted by the government that followed. And whatever your politics, from my point of view, that was a big mistake, because at the both primary and secondary level, the programmes that work for citizenship, for PSHE, for RE, which had been put together, really were world leading, and they were effectively completely abandoned, and they haven't really been replaced with anything. So citizenship and PSHE have got to become more prominent in the primary curriculum, as well as everything I just said about RE. And hopefully the curriculum review, since it's ongoing, might be susceptible to your committee's recommendations on that, if you made any.
Thank you. Dr. Dhaliwal, could I ask you, you've mentioned faith schools. What role do you think schools, including faith schools in the UK, play in community cohesion? Pretty broad.
I think we still are really dealing with parallel lives. And that's been promoted and enabled by government agendas. So I think faith schools absolutely lead to parallel lives. They lead to insular communities. They, as I said, have reproductive effects because you have to be a member of a particular gurdwara in order to get admission to that particular school. So therefore you attend that gurdwara more, you become part of that congregation, you're counted amongst its members, you get access to funding, etc. So I think they're insular, I think they're problematic, I think they're particularly problematic in terms of PSHE because I did a few interviews with Catholic schools actually, and they were very clear that yes, they'll follow the national curriculum, but they will also talk about their particular moral values. And that means that they will make it clear that homosexuality is not acceptable within their particular version of that religion, right? So they will still do that, and that's why we have higher levels of bullying and harassment within those schools. And we've also taken on, with Sarah Khan actually, we took on one particular school, the Al Hijra Trust, and the discrimination against girls within that school, the gender segregation, the books that were available were all about, and the teachings all about kind of justifying abuse, marital rape, domestic abuse, and using kind of literal text in order to justify that. So very discriminatory, not particularly good on sex and relationships education. But I just want to add on to that actually, as Andrew was talking, I think that we should be moving towards a beliefs and values module that is determined by central government, because we've seen in areas like Birmingham, for instance, this kind of large conservative, they weren't all fundamentalists, but they were definitely supported by fundamentalist activists. We've seen this mobilisation against particular head teachers, really aggressive, violent mobilisations, trying to push Anderton Park School away from having general conversations with primary school children about various family forms, right? Something that's very important for me as well. It's important to talk about diversity in family forms, and that head teacher was accused of wanting to sexualise children, sexualise Muslim children particularly, and of allowing the rights of sexual minorities to trump religious rights. So with that, I think it's really important for us to think, we as an organisation do this a lot, is we need to create as many spaces as possible to have discussions and the right to freedom from religion. That's how we operate. There just isn't enough, and you can see it in Sarah Khan's report, there just isn't enough space for people, particularly Asian women, I would say, within our local area, or minoritised women in our local area, to be able to talk about not believing or having questions or doubting. It's a very feminist principle, actually, to dissent and to doubt. And we need to somehow create space for that.
Thank you. It's fascinating. I've got one more question which I'd like to direct to Professor Cantle. What risks do illegal schools pose to community cohesion, and has the government done enough, do you think, to tackle this issue?
It's a huge risk. Only recently do we seem to be getting to grips with illegal schools. They do need to be tackled. I think remains to be seen whether they're tackled to the extent that they need to be. I just wanted also, though, to refer back to mainstream schools as well, because most people, and I think most schools, do not appear to understand that they are under a statutory duty to promote community cohesion. They are still under that duty. It's just not inspected upon. And we need to bring that back into the inspection regime. And then that could then be applied to illegal schools as part of the new schools bill. Obviously, this is all about trying to deal with the situation where children are separated by the school system, not just in faith schools, but in non-faith schools as well. We often see highly segregated environments, and we're trying to get those children to relate to each other through things like the school linking network. If they were in the same school in the first instance, they would grow up alongside each other, they would begin to understand each other, they would form friendships with each other. That is all denied to them. But it's much worse than that, because if schools are segregated, then so will parental networks be. There's clear evidence of that. And if parental networks are segregated, then the community organisations are segregated too. So schools are absolutely fundamental to shaping the networks within the school and community environment. And if I had to single out one area for cohesion, it has to be schools, not just faith schools, but all schools, not just in teaching, but in the way the school's admissions policies work and the way they develop their community cohesion agenda.
Thank you very much. I've just got one quick follow-up, if I may, Professor Cantle. Coming back to the religious education in schools and the curriculum, when I was at school, which was more years ago than I care to think about at the moment, it was very much the case that the curriculum was centred around Christianity. That was your religious education, and there was some smattering of other religions as a sort of, nod to what goes on in the rest of the world. Is that still the case? And if that is still the case, do you think that moving to a balanced all religions and none curriculum would have a positive effect on community cohesion?
Yes, I do. My religious education was longer ago than yours, I can assure you of that. But at the moment, we just do not have sufficient religious education of any kind. Religious education teachers are in short supply. The work that is devoted to it is very patchy. In some schools it's good, in some schools it's virtually non-existent. Obviously, there's a tendency in faith schools to focus on religious instruction rather than on religious education. And it needs to be balanced by worldviews, not just religious views, but worldviews. So there's a huge amount of work to be done here. Andrew's referred to his childhood and going back to visit a mosque. If we could extend proper religious education to all schools, and hopefully to some of the parental networks as part of that, inviting them to visit other religious institutions and so on, then I think we would take a pretty big step forward. But at the moment, it's underfunded, under-resourced in every sense, and it's just not regarded as important as evidently it is.
Can I say something about schools, just because it's... I mean, first of all, obviously, on the question about illegal schools, I mean, this is an incredibly important issue. 6,000 children are in illegal schools in this country. The bill that's going through Parliament will address some of that, but not all of it. It really does need addressing. Safeguarding failures, educational neglect, children coming out without even the English language, and so on. These are all really important things. But in relation to even state faith schools, some of the things that shock us in illegal schools would be legal if they were happening in state faith schools. And I think we have to remember that. Not only is the school gate effect really important that Ted talks about, of parental and family and community mixing that takes place in schools that are more mixed, but sometimes you just have to step outside the current situation. We're very unusual in this country in even having state schools that select on religious grounds. Most countries that do have state religious schools in other European jurisdictions have them, but they're not allowed to choose their pupils and parents on religious grounds. You wouldn't have it in any other public service, whether a library or a hospital. In hospitals, people wait in waiting rooms together. Maybe they chat, but they're all in it together. In libraries, in other civic institutions, you have people from all different backgrounds. The idea that we have segregated state schools, 100% funded by the state, but have this segregatory effect, which is reproductive, as Dr. Dhaliwal said, is just, when you step outside of the situation, because we're all used to it in our country, it's vaguely shocking.
It's shocking.
And it has an enormous impact on cohesion, but it's been a taboo for lots of previous investigations into cohesion, and I think Ted's given good reasons, Dr. Dhaliwal's given good reasons why it shouldn't be taboo. It should be taken on.
Thank you, Alex. Just before we move on to the next section, I just wanted to come back to you, Professor, if I could. There are some examples that are obviously not too historic, but examples where we've tried to see integration through education in Northern Ireland to help with community cohesion. Is there any lesson that we could learn from there, or perhaps anything we could learn to do better in terms of removing barriers from Northern Ireland as an example?
Well, I spent quite a lot of time in Northern Ireland, and regrettably, most of the schools are highly segregated along faith lines. There's very few mixed schools. A small number of mixed schools are in middle-class neutral areas. So it's not a good example to draw upon, unfortunately. And I do think that we really have to get our policy straight on faith schools. And that is a problem for politicians. We saw David Cameron support the 50% limit on a single faith in faith schools. We then saw Theresa May immediately reverse that policy. I don't know where we are now with the various political party policies on this particular crucial subject. In my view, the very least we should be insisting upon is a 50% limit on single faith in any school. That's not to deny faith schools, it's to put a limit on the single faith. Obviously, there are others that go further and say we should get rid of faith schools altogether. And I entirely understand that argument, because faith schools are not performing the role that they should be performing and have a lower proportion of SEN pupils. They're very socially selective. That's why they have the better results. So there's a lot of work to be done on faith schools. But the one policy that political parties need to get straight is, are we going to have a 50% limit on single faith within any school, as advocated by David Cameron and many other people on both sides of the House? That is, I think, probably one of the most crucial questions that only politicians can answer.
Thank you very much. Kirith.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Dhaliwal, I think I'm going to come to you first. How do you think differences or perceived differences in cultural values and social attitudes between different communities impact that cohesion?
I'd have to go back to what I tried to say right at the beginning is that there's been a real stoking of anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, all the way through from the press to politicians, and we've felt really, really sad and disappointed to see that it's continuing with the current government. The kind of pictures of being involved in raids. There's lots of words that have been used in order to demean migration and migrants. It's having real effects on the women that we support, because they feel absolutely terrified to be moving around, even if they do have the right to remain in this country, and they can feel that hatred, disgust. So the stuff around beds in sheds, having little photo shoots in beds in sheds, it's demeaning. It's about associating migrants with a sense of disgust, right? Sorry, I've lost the thread of your question, but I guess what I wanted to say was, I think we need to address some of the things that Hope Not Hate have raised in their reports around the summer riots, which is that the foundation had been laid. It didn't take much to bring that up. There weren't all far-right activists there. There were hundreds of people involved, and it was absolutely terrifying for anyone that knows they're going to be subjected to colour racism. It was a complete revisioning of colour racism, the level of racist violence that we used to see in kind of the 80s, right, the 70s and 80s. So we need to address that head on.
Do you think it's getting worse? And also, do you think it's fear that's being exploited rather than any truth to any of those perceptions?
There's absolutely a lot of fear mongering, and it's a kind of politics of fear that breeds fear amongst minorities that live in this country, even established minorities. And we knew that there was going to be a ripple effect. So the people that were pulled out of taxis, that were punched in the street, the African Caribbean woman who was punched in the street, all of those images, those things are not to do with people knowing the migration status or the immigration status of that individual. It's basic, crude colour racism, and we can sense it. In our local area, we did quite a lot of work around the time of the Go Home van, and what we found is that there was this, people had swallowed up a lot of the kind of myth making, and this kind of sense of illegal, someone can be illegal. Whereas we know, the Migration Observatory have told us that actually a lot of the people that are coming on boats are making asylum applications, and a lot of those are successful. Like 75% of the people of the 94% people that make those asylum applicants are successful. We need to have an element of compassion. We need a public campaign to push that compassion.
Andrew, did you want to add anything?
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think that I also agree that the political messaging, although there's been a change of administration, doesn't seem to have changed that much. There's still a lot of monstering of migration. There's still a lot of hot rhetoric about both asylum seekers and general, non-refugee migrants. And if that continues, then it will continue to set the background conditions for more violence and more racism and more hostility. And I think it's a shame if people in responsible positions, especially of political leadership, take riots simply as the opportunity to make points about law and order, rather than as an opportunity to make points about how we can live well together and how our society can be enriched by diversity, but also can be given a unity as a result of that diversity. And that's the sort of messaging that we really need, because if we go back to your question about whether or not there are some different cultural values and beliefs between people who migrate here and people whose families have been here longer, that's inarguable. Of course there are. There are. You can see it in opinion polls and surveys that there are very different views of all types on all sorts of social and moral questions, and people skew one way or another based on their culture and ethnicity. But cohesion can't be about making everyone the same. It's got to be about finding a shared, and I believe, as other witnesses here believe, that should be a framework based on equality and human rights, but a shared framework for us to be a society together. And I think that not trying to erase that difference, whilst at the same time having a robust framework of values that allows us to live in a liberal democratic society together, is really important.
And do you think it's that government rhetoric that you've both mentioned and the sort of policies around immigration that are driving this negative impact around community cohesion, or is it sort of a combination, or almost a balance of sort of attitudes or immigration in itself generally, as well as that government rhetoric that's being pushed and anti-immigrant policies that's having that negative impact on community cohesion?
I think it's absolutely being stoked. So over time in Southall, we've had this great level of solidarity within our communities to fight off the far right, for instance. And there was definitely, you could see that in terms of people that were mobilising to keep racist violence off their streets, right, in the wake of the first round of the riot. So you could see that coming together, right? You could see that level of solidarity. But I think we need to remember that actually, globally, a lot of people subscribe to human rights. So there may be different cultural practices, but actually there's a widespread belief and commitment to human rights values. And in fact, lots of women from South Asia, for instance, contributed to the development of human rights. And in this country, we've all contributed to the development and understanding of equality and non-discrimination and equality law as well. So there is diversity is important. Everyday multiculturalism is important. Being able to kind of access a range of activities, clothing, food, and appreciating that is one thing. But actually making some really firm commitments to valuing migration and recognizing the value of migration it's really vital right now.
I mean, I agree with all of that, but I don't want to evade your question. And obviously we do work with people who are asylum seekers because of their non-religious beliefs. We support them in their claims, or people who are apostates from their religious community and often come under threats of violence. So, I mean, it would be wrong to deny that there weren't different problems in different, religious communities that are different from problems that exist in other ethnic communities or in society generally. I think that's the
saying.
point of the question, in a way.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
But I think, does that make sense? But I think the answer to that is education, support, human rights, equality, and proper interventions, protection of people in those circumstances. We do not protect people from religious violence enough in this country. We do not protect free thinkers, dissenters.
And we don't have enough secular spaces
where
they can feel safe. And
so I think we would both circle back to that as the answer, right? We would say, but we need secular spaces and also to be better ambassadors for the values of rule of law, freedom, human rights and democracy. I don't know how people are expected to buy into and believe in freedom, democracy and the rule of law if they're faced with racist rioters, And I think that it's incumbent on us all, therefore, to try and act in accordance with these values and to make principled interventions. But again, also, there is an extent to which social cohesion must also be based on freedom of thought and freedom of belief, and some people have views that other people disagree with, and you've got to live with them as long as they're not harming others. But I think an unwillingness or unwillingness of government, locally and nationally, to be principled, to be secular, to prioritise equality and human rights and the rights of every person undermines, our claim that those values are ones that we prioritise. And so I think we need to sort of fix that. I guess Ted will probably have views about this as well, of course.
And Professor Cantle as well, if I might just add, do you think there are any other factors that are driving a lack of community cohesion, for example, the cost of living crisis?
I think they are, but I think one of the key issues here is the role of social media. This is, to my mind, far, far more influential than government rhetoric. Really, the extent of the impact of that, really, I think, is just not fully appreciated. Race migration has become entwined with a new political identity. And we've seen that in the populist movements across the Western world. And if you're on social media, it's just impossible to ignore that rhetoric. And then if you look at it from any particular community's perspective, suddenly migrants arrive in that community. There's no preparation. They don't no idea where they've come from, where they're going to. They're put into hotels or into rented accommodation near them without any involvement, without any commitment or understanding. And inevitably, there's going to be confusion, divisions, and in some cases, hatred and discrimination. And we also, I think, have failed to take account of population growth. Migrants are getting the blame for the lack of housing, the lack of public services. And it's true that migration has created population growth, but they're not to blame. The blame should be squarely put on the failure to upgrade housing and public services in line with that population. So we've created a situation really where public services have just failed to keep up with the level of population with the level of need, and it's inevitable that there will be competition for resources within communities as a result. So I think we've got to look at this in the round. It's not just simply to do with government rhetoric. I think we have to look at the way integration has failed at the local level, the way public services have not kept pace, and particularly the role of social media and the much, much harsher narrative which really has developed a political identity of its own.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kirith, and thank you so much to everybody that's given their time and their expertise today. We're really grateful. And as with the previous panel, if there is anything that you'd like to follow up, please just write to us and we will include that in the evidence as well. Thank you very much. That brings this session to a close. Order. Thank you.
Thank you.